We've seen over the past few weeks, I was going to say couple of weeks, but it's been a few weeks now since COVID hit, that all 12 of the tribes of Israel received their apportioned plots of land. That's where we've been in the book of Joshua. 12 tribes, 2.5 tribes picked up some land on the east side of the Jordan River. The other 9.5 tribes would settle on the west side of the Jordan River, what God calls the land of Canaan, the promised land. And so we're down to the very last tribe. We're down to the tribe of Dan. So if you'll look in Joshua chapter 19, verse 40, let's just get going here. Dan is the last of the 12 tribes that will receive an inheritance. And in Joshua chapter 19, verse 40, Dan is interesting, and you'll see why I say that in just a second. In Joshua 19, verse 40, it says, "The seventh lot fell to the sons of Dan according to their families, and Mayarkon and Rakkon with the territory over against Joppa." Now, if you know anything about the Israeli Jewish map, Joppa is Tel Aviv. If you look at a Jewish map today and you see Tel Aviv, you know where Tel Aviv is, in the southern coastal, right along the Mediterranean coast. Joppa, the place called Joppa, where Simon the tanner was, where Peter was when God brought the dream to Peter and the sheet came down like the four corners with all the animals in it. Peter was in the city of Joppa. Peter was in the land of Dan when that occurred, when the church went out to the Gentiles through Peter. This all happened in Dan's land called Joppa. And so Dan would get this piece of territory very far south. But look what it says in verse 47. It says, "The territory of the sons of Dan proceeded beyond them." So we see something that goes on here, that even though Dan got a very specific territory in the southern central part of Israel, they're also going to get a bigger piece of land somewhere else, or at least additional land. So the territory of the sons of Dan proceeded beyond them for the sons of Dan, and this is the reason. The sons of Dan went up and they fought with Leshem, and they captured it. Then they struck it with the edge of the sword, and they possessed it, and they settled in it, and they called Leshem Dan. They renamed this town that was called Leshem, they renamed it Dan after the name of Dan, their father. Now, Dan, the Hebrew word Dan, means judge. Daniel, the man Daniel, his name means God is my judge. So this tribe Dan has picked up this other piece of land. I want to show you what's going on here. Look in Judges chapter 134. Just look what it says here. It says, "The Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country." Remember. I know it's been a long time, but remember this. When Joshua came in with the armies of Israel, the one unified army of Israel, he defeated every major king in the land of Canaan so that Israel could not be forced out of the land again. Like I said before, they cut the head off of the snake. And so the power in the land of Canaan was transferred from the kings of the land to Israel. And then Joshua and his major conquests were finished. And each of these tribes of Israel had to get their territory, and then they had to go into their little tribal area and continue fighting warfare. There were more people to kill. Joshua and the united army didn't kill everybody in the land of Canaan. It was left up to the tribal Jewish armies to do that. That's what we see here in Judges 134. Warfare between the tribe of Dan and the Canaanites that they needed to kill. So it says the Amorites. These are the people of Canaan. The Amorites, in warfare with Dan, they forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down into the valley. So there is fierce warfare that's going on, and Dan loses the battle. Now, this is a faith issue. Dan should have never lost the battle because God said, I will lead you in and I will destroy everybody that needs destroying. But Dan didn't fight hard enough for whatever reason, and they let the Amorites keep them out of the land. They simply couldn't defeat the pagan, God-hating, false God-worshiping Amorites the way God wanted them to. So they, the people of Dan, were forced into half of their territory. They were pushed out of part of their territory by the Amorites, and so the land that they had left to live on wasn't enough. So they did something about it. They went north to Laish, this place that we just saw called Leshem. Now look where Dan is on the map. You can't get any further north than that in Israel. This is the northernmost point of Israel. This area to the right here, if you follow Jewish politics today, is called the Golan Heights. Rocky cliffs along this water here, the Golan Heights. So Dan had their tribal territory given to them by God way down here. You see Joppa right here. They were kicked out of part of the land, so Dan went up here and they found a city called Leshem, and they said, we'll defeat that city and we'll send some of our people up there. So the tribe of Dan is the only tribe that's actually split in the land of Canaan, and that's the way they stayed until the north fell in 722 BC. So interesting information about Dan. They went and they took this town. I'm going to give you another name of Leshem. It's Laish, L-A-I-S-H. You'll see it written both ways, Laish or Leshem in the Old Testament. Now tell me what the worst thing about that city at the top called Dan is. There's one thing that's worse than anything else. Remember, Israel split. There was a time under King Saul, King David, King Solomon, where Israel was one united kingdom. All 12 tribes working as one engine. One kingdom of Israel. And then the kingdom split after Solomon. Solomon's son Rehoboam stayed in the south with Judah and Benjamin, and the 10 tribes of the north created a coalition under a man named Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam was afraid that Israel would go back and worship their God Yahweh where? Where was Israel? What city was Israel supposed to worship their God Yahweh in? Jerusalem, at the temple that Solomon had built. And so what happened is Jeroboam said, I don't want the 10 tribes going all the way back to Jerusalem because we're going to lose some of them. So I've come up with a new idea. I'm going to make 2 golden calves. And instead of worshiping in Jerusalem at the temple, Israel, the northern tribes, the 10 tribes of Israel, are going to worship at one of 2 places where I will set an altar and a golden calf. Does that remind you of anything in Israel's history, the golden calf of Aaron when Moses is getting the 10 commandments? Jeroboam did it 1,000 years later. And in the city of Bethel, which horribly means the house of God, in the city that is named the house of God, Jeroboam set up a false idol called a golden calf. And in the northern city of Dan, up here, in this place where this great tribe went and needed more territory, and they went and took the territory through military victory, they took it from these Leshemites. In the city of Dan, Jeroboam set up the second golden calf. Amy and I were there in 2018. We saw the altar. It's been, archaeologists have dug it up. They know exactly where it was, where all the animal pens were for the false sacrifices to the false gods and all that. They have the horns of the altar there. It's a fascinatingly pagan and unsettling place to be. knowing that Israel, who was called out to worship the one true God, chose instead for hundreds of years to worship false gods there in Dan. A little bit of the history of Dan. Verse 48 says, this was the inheritance of the tribe of the sons of Dan, according to their families, their cities, with their villages. In verse 49, we shift gears. All the territories have been given out now, and it's time for Joshua. It's time for the great Joshua to earn a piece of land himself. When they finished apportioning, in verse 48, it says, when they, this is Israel, when they finished apportioning the land for inheritance by its borders, the sons of Israel gave an inheritance in their midst to Joshua, the son of Nun. Anybody remember what tribe Joshua was from? Not Joshua. Caleb was from the tribe of Judah. Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim. Listen to what it says here about where Joshua... Now, if Joshua is from the tribe of Ephraim, and every tribe is supposed to live within their tribal territory, where do you think Joshua is going to get a piece of land? In the land of Ephraim, in the territory of Ephraim. And that's exactly what happened. In verse 50 it says, in accordance with the command of Yahweh, they gave Joshua the city for which he asked. Now this is interesting. Joshua, the great commander of the army of Israel, the great national administrator of Israel, Joshua asks for a piece of land that's not what you and I would ask for. Joshua asks for a rugged piece of land, an infertile piece of mountainous territory in Ephraim. What a man Joshua was. He didn't want the easy road. He didn't want the choicest land. Joshua continued to lead by example by choosing this area called Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim. Rocky, like Texas hill country kind of rocky. This is the land that he chose. Now this is Joshua. He could have had the pick of the litter in Ephraim. He could have had the well-watered land, the green land in the valleys, but not Joshua. So Joshua didn't ask for the best of the land, and we see added to Joshua's resume in the Scripture, as if this man wasn't great enough, we see added to his resume as the greatest military leader Israel had had to date, and as the greatest national administrator, now we have added to his role, builder. He didn't grow old. He's an 85-year-old guy. He doesn't grow old and say, give me the best land and give me servants to work the land. Joshua says, give me a piece of land I can cultivate and I'll turn it into something. What a man. What a man to follow. It says in verse 50, in accordance with the command of the Lord, they gave him the city that he asked for, Timnath-Serah in the hill country. And it says about Joshua, so Joshua built the city and settled in it. Remember, a lot of the land that Israel is going into there's already fortified cities there. The Canaanites are being killed, being driven out of these cities and killed, and Israel's walking into well-built houses. They're walking into administrative buildings. They're walking into vineyards that have choice and mature grapes on them. They're walking into arbor trees, these areas of trees filled with fruit. They're walking into pens with sheep and goats and flocks and herds. They're walking into a well-established land. God gave them a turnkey situation in the land of Canaan, but not Joshua. Joshua didn't want it. Joshua didn't take the easy road. Joshua worked for what he got. Joshua took a rugged piece of infertile mountainside and built a city there for his family to live. If you want to find a name for your kid, Joshua should start bubbling up to the top of the lists. He was quite a man. Verse 51 ends this section. These are the inheritances. This is the land of Israel, has been apportioned out according to the map you see on the board there. These are the inheritances which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the household of the tribes of the sons of Israel distributed by lot in Shiloh before Yahweh at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Boy, that's a long sentence, isn't it? A lot going on there. All it says is that God does exactly what God says He's going to do. That's what that verse says to me. 500 years ago, God promised a man named Abraham, I'm going to give this land to you. I'm going to give this land to you and to your Jewish descendants. It will always be Jewish land. When Abraham died, do you know how much real estate Abraham owned of all of those different colors and all of those tribes of Israel you see on the board? You know how much land Abraham owned? He owned one cave. And you know why he owned the cave? So he could bury his wife there. Abraham promised by Yahweh, you will own this land, died never having owned 1 foot of it except for a cave in a city of Hebron, a cave called Machpelah, where Abraham buried his beloved wife, Sarah. That's the only reason he bought the land, because he needed a burial plot for his wife. You know who else is buried in that cave today? Abraham is in that cave. You know who else is in that cave? Isaac. You know who else is in that cave? Rebekah. You know who else is in that cave? Jacob. And you know who else is in that cave? Leah. The patriarchs of Israel. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their 3 wives are all buried in that one place in the cave called Machpelah in the city near Hebron today, run by the Muslim Brotherhood, unfortunately. One of the holiest sites on all the earth where the great patriarchs of Israel are buried is run by non-God-fearing Muslims today. But that's the fact of the Bible. I love the history of it. I just love going into this and seeing where these places are and what the current significance of these places still are. So the high priest Eleazar, the son of Aaron, had a part in this. Joshua, the son of Nun, had a part in this. And the households of the tribes of Israel all had a part in apportioning the land of Israel out so that it looks like what it looks like on the board. They did this from the place in Shiloh where they actually brought the tabernacle of God, Moses' tabernacle, and they set it up. And these things happened under the direction of the high priest, while Yahweh was at the door of the tent of meeting overseeing every inch of ground He gave His people Israel. It's a beautiful story. The last verse says, so they finished dividing the land. And that land, as you see it right there, will be the land of Israel for the next, this happens about 1400 BC, 1446, Moses, 1400 or so. King David, just to give you a timeline for those of you who like numbers, King David shows up at 1000 BC, so 450 years later, King David is on the scene. When King David rules Israel, that's exactly what it looks like, what you're looking at right there. When King Solomon rules Israel, this is exactly what it looked like. When the territory split, as we talked about earlier, after Solomon, it no longer looked like this. I showed you last time that Simeon got absorbed up into Ephraim and Manasseh, so this group of the tribe of Simeon wasn't in the south anymore. The only 2 tribes that were in the south were Benjamin and Judah. So when you go through the book of the Bible, in the books of the Bible, and you say, well, how do the books of the Bible break down? Let me give you just a couple of minutes of this because I think it's important. You go through 4 major historical books in the Old Testament: 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. Those are the major historical books in the Old Testament that talk about the land of Israel and what happened with Israel and her tribes. In 1 Kings, we have a united kingdom. In 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel is all about King Saul, the first king of Israel. First Samuel is Saul. And so this is what the map looks like, exactly what it looks like on the board. When you get into 2 Samuel, there's a new king that's been reigned. What's his name? He's a young ruddy man who takes care of the sheep in the field. He's the youngest of his father Jesse. He's the one that Nathan came to the house and said, no, this can't be him. Or Samuel, said, no, it must be Eliab. Eliab, the firstborn of Jesse, must be the king. Because look at the handsomeness of this man. Look at the broadness of his shoulders. Surely God is looking on this man to be the king of Israel. And what was God's famous line to Samuel? Son, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. It's not Eliab. And one after another, the sons of Jesse passed by Samuel as Samuel is waiting for God to make known who the next king of Israel will be. And finally, Samuel says, there must be another. There must be another, because God hasn't made known to me in your household yet, Jesse, who the king will be. And Jesse said, yeah, there's one more. Jesse says, there's one more. He's my youngest son. He's out in the field. He's a lowly shepherd. Samuel says, bring him here now. And King David is chosen by God to lead Israel that looked exactly like it does on the board. 1 Samuel is about Saul. 2 Samuel is about David. By the time you get to 1 Kings, the next major historical installment in the book, we're talking about David's son Solomon. David's son Solomon. And when Solomon ruled Israel, the map looked exactly like it looks on the board. Saul ruled for 40 years, David ruled for 40 years, Solomon ruled for 40 years. And after Solomon's rule, the map would change because Solomon was a fool. And Solomon chose to gather wives for himself. The Bible says he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And the Bible said, God warned them, if you go after false God-fearing wives, they will lead you away from me. You'll stop worshiping Yahweh and you'll start worshiping the false gods of Canaan, the people that I destroyed from before you so that you wouldn't worship them. You will fall into that. And in the book of 1 Kings, by the time you get to 1 Kings chapter 11, Solomon's sins are before the Lord openly. And the Lord says, I'm going to rip the kingdom from you. And so what we've been studying for a couple of months, this map that's being created by God in the book of Joshua under King Solomon, after 40 years of a reign, God says, I'm going to destroy the map. All those boundary lines I set up are going to change. And so Judah and Benjamin would stay south. Simeon went up into Ephraim and Manasseh. And the map changed with Solomon's son Rehoboam and Jeroboam. By the time you get into 1 Kings chapter 16, the kingdom has split. Solomon is dead. And you start going through the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. Now there is a king of Judah who's the most famous king of Judah that will ever live. Someone tell me his name. He's never reigned as the king of Judah before, although he's the most important king of Judah that's ever lived. He's alive and well right now, having gone to the cross 2,000 years ago, having been crucified, buried, and resurrected. He's sitting at the right hand of the Father right now, and he is waiting the way that King Charles III of England was waiting to be coronated at the death of his mother. Jesus of Nazareth is waiting to be coronated the King of Israel, the King of Judah, the King of Kings, and the Lord of Lords. And he's just waiting there at the right hand of the Father to be made the monarch of all the earth, the King, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. By the time you get into 1 Kings chapter 16, the kingdom has split. But those kings that you start reading about in the south, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Uzziah, Hezekiah, Josiah, all of those kings are David's sons. You think about the monarchy, what just happened in England, and you think, oh, big deal, it's some antiquated way of government. We don't do that. We have presidents. You don't have to be the son of George Bush to be the president. Anybody can be the president, etc. It's not that way in God's economy. Don't miss sight of the fact that in God's economy, the way that God administers the earth, the monarch rules. The monarch's name is Jesus Christ. The monarch's name once was King David. And unless you were of King David's blood, you did not become the king. And that's why we have an interesting story in Luke chapter 4 or Luke chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 1. We have these two interesting genealogies about the life of Jesus Christ. And one of the genealogies follows Jesus' mother, Mary. And one of the genealogy follows Jesus' earthly father, the man who would raise him, the man named Joseph. And you know what's intriguing about both of those genealogies? Both of them trace their blood back to King David. They have royal blood. Mary and Joseph the carpenter are both in the family of King David. If they were not, then Jesus doesn't have a right to the throne. So it's very interesting, everything that's been going on in the news with the monarchy. That's the way God set up Israel, and that's the way God will run Israel for all eternity. Jesus will be the King of Israel. It's not just a word, it's a monarchical title. He will sit as the King of the universe forever. Verse 20, let's see if we can get into these cities of refuge. Something shifts in verse 20 entirely. There's a type of person on the earth who unintentionally and accidentally kills another human being. Now, in our legal system, we have something called murder, and we have something entirely different called manslaughter. When I was in high school, there was a girl that was in our class, and her brother got out on the highway one night. He was drunk, and he entered the highway on-ramp in the wrong direction. He was coming home from a club in downtown Corpus Christi. We lived about 20 miles out of town. And I won't mention his name, but he got into a head-on collision with someone and killed the people in that car. He did not get in that car when he left that bar with the intention of murdering that person. That wasn't his intention. It wasn't his motive. He was just trying to get home. But the fact of the matter is, a human life was taken on that night because of this man's negligence. And the Bible calls him a manslayer, or a manslaughterer. Now, there's a difference between a person who wakes up in the morning with hatred in his heart and a motivation to go and kill somebody, or someone that falls into a fit of rage that comes on them and kills somebody. That person the Bible calls a murderer, and that person should be killed. But it's very interesting. In this chapter, Joshua chapter 20, we get to see just how highly God favors human life. The sanctity of human life is on parade in Joshua chapter 20. The holiness, if you will, of human life. The value of human life. Don't just go by this chapter quickly and say, oh, God set up 6 cities in case this happens. Stop and understand the character of God and what He's showing us about how He values the sanctity of human life. Every life. So Yahweh speaks here of these sanctuary cities, these cities of refuge. And He speaks of these cities of refuge. They're so important to God that human life be protected at all costs, that human life be protected fairly and in a just way. that he mentions this in 4 different books of the Bible. He doesn't say this one time and bounce off of it. In 4 different books of the Bible, God brings up the cities of refuge because life is just that important. So God is stressing the sanctity of human life and also the absolute corruption of blood in the land. The shedding of blood will pollute the land, and it has to be cleansed. Look what it says in Exodus. I'm going to show you a couple of these 4 verses or 4 different books of the Bible. Obviously, Joshua chapter 20 is one of them. But look what he says in Exodus 21:12. This is right after the 10 Commandments are given in Exodus chapter 20. And God speaks, and he says, "He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death." Now, remember the difference between a murderer and a manslayer here. Keep those in mind. We go back and forth a little bit. He who strikes a man so that that man dies shall surely be put to death. But, here's the difference. In the very first phrase, you've got a murderer on your hand. If you strike a man and kill that man, you will be put to death, and that's God's inviolate human law. But, he says, there's an exception. If the man, the person who killed the other, if he did not lie in wait for him, if he wasn't waiting, seething, ready to kill the man, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place to which he may flee. Now let me ask you, when you read that, who's God protecting? What life is God protecting here? We have a phrase in American jurisprudence, innocent, finish it, until proven guilty. That, my friends, is a biblical truth. Whose life is God protecting? The man who killed someone. I will appoint to you a place which that man may flee. If he's not guilty of murder, then he shall not be killed. And God himself says, I will protect his life. The book of Numbers, chapter 35, verse 6. The cities which you shall give to the Levites, now we get a number, shall be 6 cities of refuge. Who are the cities of refuge for? Who is God protecting? Who is God showing the sanctity of life, the value of human life for? For the person that could possibly be treated as a guilty subject when he's innocent. You think, oh, well, certainly God is protecting the one who was killed. Certainly God is protecting the innocent family and the victims of the one who was killed. Yes, obviously God has a great care for them. But what we see here is God is protecting the manslayer. The cities which you shall give the Levites, the priests, shall be the 6 cities of refuge which you shall give for the manslayer to flee to. And in addition to them, you shall give 42 cities. So the Levites, the priests, would be scattered, and we'll see this next week in Joshua 21. They would be scattered to 48 cities all throughout that map I showed you. They actually say that Israel is so small that no one was ever further than 10 miles away from a Levitical priest. That's how spread out in the land God spread his Levites, his teachers of the law. So Numbers 35, a couple of verses down, still in Numbers 35, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan. See, God has this planned for for years and years before he does it. I will protect the manslayer. Because life, every life, needs to be treated fairly and with justice. And I'll protect them. When you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select for yourselves cities to be your cities of refuge. There were 6 of them. That the manslayer who has killed any person, and here's the phrase again, unintentionally, may flee there. In America, what is our city of refuge called in America? Does America have 6 cities of refuge where a manslayer can go and be protected until trial? Or do we have another system where a manslayer goes and he's incarcerated in a place called jail, where he's protected until he can get a fair jury trial? Because God is interested in truth. Truth and fairness and justice. And if you did it, you'll die for it. And if you didn't, no one will touch you. And God says, I'll protect you. It's an interesting, very, very interesting statement from the Father here concerning the manslayer. The very next verse says, the city shall be to you as a refuge from the avenger. So now we have another party come into play. You've got the manslayer who accidentally kills somebody, but you've got this person called the avenger. Because every family had a Goel, an avenger, a blood avenger. The city shall be to you as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer will not die until he stands before the congregation for trial. What do you call that? Innocent until proven guilty. And everybody in America, according to the Scripture, everybody deserves that right before God, to be held innocent until they are proven by witnesses to be guilty. Again, whose life is it that God is protecting here? Someone has already died. That life has been, it's done. God's not protecting the dead life. God's not even protecting the family of the innocent life that was taken. God's protecting the one who killed. The manslayer is protected until the facts about his case are told. Like I said, fair trial, justice has to be served. There has to be order in this world. God set this world up very orderly. If a person is found to have killed another person unintentionally, then God will protect that person in the city of refuge, and he will be safe there. Now the question becomes, for how long? Keep following along here. How long would God protect a manslayer? Look what it says in Numbers 35:25. It says, the congregation shall deliver the manslayer. This is the congregation of Israel. This is a jury of your peers. Jews deciding the fate of Jews. The congregation of Israel shall deliver the manslayer from the hand of the blood avenger, because the blood avenger wants to kill the manslayer. But the congregation shall deliver the manslayer from the hand of the blood avenger, and the congregation shall restore him, because he's innocent. And he's been found innocent. The congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge, to which he fled. And here's the time period. He shall live in it until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the holy oil. So God protected the manslayer, but did he get off scot-free as if nothing ever happened? Or was there still a consequence for that night he got in that car drunk and entered that highway going the wrong direction and took human life? There's a consequence. You read the consequence right here. That manslayer was safe. He would not be killed by the family of the person that he killed. God would protect him, but only while he remained inside the walls of the cities of refuge. If he left those walls before the high priest died, then the avenger could catch him. Look what he says in the very next verse. You think, man, God says a lot about this. He sure does. If the manslayer at any time, this is the one who unintentionally killed someone else, if the manslayer at any time goes beyond the border of his city of refuge to which he may flee, if he goes outside the city walls, he's taking his life into his own hands. He says, if he goes beyond the wall, then the blood avenger, if the blood avenger finds him, because what family member would ever forget? I've got a good friend, and I won't say his name because I'll just start crying, whose little brother was killed by a manslayer. By a drunken, this is a different story, by a drunken manslayer. You know the man, his name is Clay Jackson. Clay's little brother was killed by a manslayer 20 years ago. And I guarantee you that Clay remembers that. I promise you. If that man goes outside of the city and the blood avenger finds him outside the border of his city of refuge, and the blood avenger kills the manslayer, he will not be guilty of blood because he should have remained in his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. God says, I will protect you, but there are rules. You will live the rest of your life inside that city. That's the only place you'll be safe in all of Israel until the high priest dies. If you walk outside that city to go walk your sheep and you get killed, the deal is off. You stay within the walls of those cities. So there is the sanctity of human life. Nobody gets off scot-free. God holds them to a consequence. But after the death of the high priest, the manslayer shall return to the land of his possession. This is all for the manslayer who kills unintentionally. No fit of rage, no motive. But to be fair, we need to talk about intentional murder for just a moment. In Numbers chapter 35:16, because God is not a fool. And God says, when a man slays another man, by man's hand, that killer will be killed. Without question. You will not pollute my land. Numbers 35:16. When a jury of your peers has been established and you've gone through a fair and cautious trial, if you are found to be a murderer, God has a whole different set of facts in mind. If he struck him down with an iron object so that he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Without question, he is to be put to death by the family's blood avenger. Every family would have one. In Numbers 35:19, the blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. He shall put him to death when he meets him. Very interesting. We have a jurisprudence situation in America where if you are found guilty of capital murder and you're given a death sentence, the family of the dead person doesn't have anything to do with you being killed. It's someone in the lethal injection department, or the electric chair, or the firing squad, or hanging, or however else we kill people today, that God says to kill. But in Israel, God set up a system where a family member, a victim, would be the one who killed the murderer. Imagine that. The blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. He shall put him to death when he meets him. Look what it says a couple verses later. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of witnesses. Multiple witnesses. At least 2 or 3 witnesses. No one will ever die according to God's law. No one will ever die according to one person's mouth. Because you could have someone that hates you just enough to lie about you, to say, I saw him do that. And God says, no, I'm not going to allow that. No person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. A lot of things about the life of Jesus and a woman that was brought to him in adultery come to mind. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Lady, where are all the witnesses? There was a lot wrong done about the law in Jesus' day. No person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall not take ransom. Now listen to this. Every murderer will die. There's no way out of it. There's only one way to purge the land of blood guiltiness. So God makes certain that men don't start in with their negotiations. See, this is the problem with American jurisprudence today. Everybody wants to enter into negotiations. We'll give you 10 years. You serve 10 years and serve 3 years of probation. In the Bible, God says, garbage. Make no deal with a murderer. If anyone kills a person, that murderer shall be put to death. You shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. No deals for the rich. No buying yourself out of the guilty verdict. In Israel, if you're found to be guilty of murder, you die at the hand of the blood avenger. You will die at the hand of the blood avenger. Remember, in the Bible, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Justice always had to be perfect. The crime, the punishment had to fit the crime always. And the other thing about the land in Israel was that it had to be cleansed of blood guiltiness. Tell me why the land had to be cleansed. Tell me why the land of Canaan, of all the place on all the earth, tell me why what I showed you on that map had to remain pure. Because God lived on that land. Because Yahweh dwelt among Israel on that land. In Numbers 35:32, you shall not take ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge. So if a man is not found to be a murderer, he's simply guilty of manslaughter. Don't take a payout from him so that he can leave his city of refuge early. What God says goes. Don't take a ransom for him so that he may return to live in the land before the death of the priest. And here we get into the pollution idea and why the land has to be pure. So you shall not pollute the land in which you are. What's the sanctity of the land? God is showing sanctity for human life, but He's tying it into the purity of the land. You shall not pollute the land in which you are, for blood, the death of humans. Blood pollutes the land, and no expiation, no forgiveness of sin, nothing can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except for one thing, except by the blood of Him who shed it. The only way that God set up in the Bible for a land to be cleansed of blood guiltiness is for the killer to die. That's Bible truth. There is no expiation that can be made for the land for the blood that is shed except one way, by the blood of the killer who shed the blood. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I am Yahweh, I, the Lord Yahweh, am dwelling in the midst of the sons of Israel. You can't keep the land defiled. It was a theological necessity. It was because God is who God is, and He couldn't dwell in Israel with the Jews in an impure land. And death, whether it was on purpose, unintentional, motive-driven or not, any shedding of human blood polluted the land. It made for an unclean environment, and God couldn't live there. One more thing, and we'll get to the chapter next time. It's very short. We'll probably just read it and move on because we've covered everything. Except for the blood avenger. I want to talk about him for a minute. But in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 3, I told you there were 6 cities of refuge that God would set up the cities that we've been talking about. And God not only was very careful about setting up those cities, He was careful about making tracks to the cities. He was a building project manager. God says in Deuteronomy 19 verse 3, He talked about these cities in 4 different books of the Old Testament. Very serious about this subject. He said, you shall prepare the roads for yourself and divide into 3 parts the territory of your land, which the Lord your God will give you as a possession, so that any manslayer may flee there. What does God say here? You build the best roads in Israel leading to those 6 cities. That's how God cares for human life. You prepare the roads. The roads in Israel, according to rabbinic tradition, the best roads in Israel apparently led in and out of these 6 cities of refuge. Because there was no way a manslayer was going to be killed by a blood avenger without God giving him his day in court. And God saw to it that these cities were easy to get to. It's a fascinating, fascinating walk through the mind of God. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you.